Grab your iPod Nano and find your passwords for MySpace and YTMND, because today we're going back to the 2000s.
NEDM.
Yes, specifically we are ranking 25 2000s death metal debut albums and a handful from 1999 that felt a little bit late for the 90s list. And we're starting with the Faceless and Akeldama in 2006. Kicking things off with some truly ripping technicality here, this band may only have 4 albums and in many ways have developed a status that almost is more of a meme at this point, but goddamn did they leave a mark on both deathcore and death metal. 33 minutes of high-octane guitar work and drumming that landed them tours with Necrophagist, Nile, and Decapitated. I also like the more melodic death metal influences on tracks like All Dark Graves and Lyka. The instrumental title track is such a killer showcase of the broad array of styles they were capable of, and Ghost of a Stranger is a sick closer. Definitely an impressive debut with basically no downtime, so this one has to go to Perfection. Next up is Bloodbath with Resurrection through Carnage in 2002. Michael Ackerfeld of Opeth providing vocals on this album, which is never not a plus for me. The man is capable of such beautiful cleans, but I've always found his low death bellows to be some of the most imposing in the game, and hearing them uninterrupted here against a backdrop of pure death metal is just so satisfying. Then you've got Jonas Renski and Anders Nystrom of Catatonia grooving it up on some very entombed sounding HM2 goodness. Rounding out the lineup is Dan the Man Sueno on drums with plenty of punky, crusty beats on tracks like So You Die, but they can also get a little doomy on Mass Strangulation. Love Death Delirium with its mix of spooky atmospheric harmonies and cutthroat chugs, very at the gates. Maybe not as flashy as some of my favorites we're going to get to here, but just solid death metal to the core with a very 90s inspired sound, putting this one at great tier. Alright, we've got Cattle Decapitation with To Serve Man in 2002. I must say, this is such an early 2000s album cover. Like, I recall some of my friends talking about how edgy some of these were, like Cannibal Corpse was back in the day. Notably, Wes Bonescotter has done all of the Cattle Decapitation album covers, and man is it cool to see how his skill has improved over the years. Musically, I'd say this is pretty standard stuff. Fairly repetitious chords and tremolo lines over blast beats. The best qualities for me come in the form of Travis's layered vocals, which while still in their infancy are already pretty raunchy. Love this band and how far they've come from here, but this one is just okay to me. Alright, speaking of Decapitated, let's go with Decapitated with Winds of Creation in 2000. Fantastic riffs on this thing and extremely technical right from the start, especially for a group of kids who only ranged from 15 to 18 years old at the time. So many bangers here, traversing a gauntlet right from the start with the title track and Blessed before detouring into the groovier The First Damned. Love that crazy transition on the 9 steps and even the spooky little synth track Dance Macabre, which makes for a great lead-in to their cover of Slayer's Mandatory Suicide. Hearing elements of Immolation, Cannibal Corpse, Dying Fetus, though Vogue also cites Dimebag Darrell as an influence on the groove. What brings it down a little bit for me are the vocals, which pretty much stick to that low growl all the way through, but other than that, this thing just gets better every time I hear it, putting it at fantastic, and like a few bands on this list, you can check out my full tier list of their entire discography. But let's move on to Decrepit Birth with And Time Begins in 2003. Super raw, super brutal. With the production on this thing, it could have easily come out in the early 90s with similarities to Disgorge, Suffocation, and Cannibal Corpse. Definitely not as beloved as their more melodic direction they'd take with Diminishing Between Worlds. A little too meat and potatoes for my taste, personally. It's kind of generic and forgettable overall, but at 30 minutes, it's a brisk listen, and there's no denying the speed of those drums and the gnarly bass tone. Just one of those cases where if you've heard one song, you've basically heard them all. I think it's a little bit higher than okay, so I'm going to put it at good tier. Then, though, we've got Spawn of Possession with Cabinet in 2003. I definitely saw a few specific requests to include this album on the community tab, and another top-notch technical death metal album that hit the ground running and fully formed alongside Necrophagist and the Faceless. All three of these bands actually always make me think of the same Blade Runner quote.
The light that burns twice as bright burns half as long. And you have burned so very, very brightly, Roy.
Swarm of the Formless comes in so hard, leaving the listener in a smoldering crater for the remainder of the album, and then Hidden in Flesh follows it up in an absolutely dizzying fashion. Every track on here is a 10, but other personal favorites for me include Dirty Priest, Spawn of Possession, and Cabinet. This one also has to go to Perfection. Then we have Portal with Seepia in 2003. Portal is interesting in that they also kind of had their sound right out of the gate despite how unlike anything else it was. They've already got that kind of swarming insect sound going on, though the production is definitely more raw. I think that their modern albums, especially like Swarth and Vexovoid, have captured this better since then, but it's still neat just what an anomaly this band was in this 2000s landscape. Tempest Fugit and Sunken may be my personal favorites on this one. Not maybe one of my favorite albums on their discography or on this list, but the beginning of a very unique discography, which another one I have a tier list for. I'm going to go ahead and put this one at great tier. And by the way, I will link below a playlist with all of those different rankings from bands on this list and beyond. Check for the pinned comment. Gotta love that we started with a big F here too, by the way. But next up is Arsis with A Celebration of Guilt in 2004. One of those somewhat rare cases where the debut album is actually the highest rated, well above the rest, at least on Metal Storm, and it was ranked number 50 on Decibel's top 100 greatest death metal albums of all time. And I can see why, given the overall energy and strength of the riffs. Despite being from Virginia, this album sounds like it could have easily come straight out of Gothenburg, Sweden's melodic death metal scene. Plenty of triumphant, wailing harmonized guitars and earworm hooks. Return is a total rager. Worship Depraved gets me relentlessly banging my head. And on top of that, the entire album is written and performed by James Malone, except for the drums, which come courtesy of Mike Van Dyne. I do think the production could be a little bit better, and it's slightly overlong, so I'm going to put this one at fantastic. Then we have Ingested with Surpassing the Boundaries of Human Suffering in 2009. Getting super filthy here with this brutal bit of slam. Honestly, I probably would have eaten this up back in high school, but as someone who prefers a little bit more variety in my death metal, I find slam to be particularly dull when it's not mixed in with any other styles. Like, it can serve as a great punctuation point, which is why I like bands like Within Destruction, but on its own, it kind of gets old for me pretty fast in terms of both the guitars and especially the very gurgly vocals. That said, there are some banger riffs on here like Contorted Perception and Stillborn, which also has some solid atmosphere. And I also, like a few albums on this list, appreciate that it very much knows what it is at just 33 minutes long. Solid, but not something I feel really driven to revisit regularly, so this one's also going to okay. And by the way, again, this is only a selection of 25 albums, so feel free to share others from this decade that you enjoy down in the comments. Just don't be a dick with the whole, "You forgot In Mourning." I didn't forget, I just don't have unlimited time to entertain you.
You know how much I sacrifice?
Moving on, we have Psycroptic with The Isle of Disenchantment in 2001. Now, both my channel and Metal Forge Master Reviews have been calling this band one of the more underrated despite how long they've been around, nowadays showcasing a more kind of Lamb of God groove metal kind of sound. But these Australians kicked off their career heavy with this tech death rager packed with Floridian influenced guitars and dodgeball ping snares. Matthew Chalk providing vocals here, also in a more classic style before he was replaced for their third album with Jason Pepiot. Another case of they get much better from here, especially with 2003's Scepter of the Ancients, but there are glimmers of something more, as with Of Dull Eyes Born and Psycroptic. Solid, but feels too much just like an imitation of a lot of things I've heard done better before. I will put it at good tier. Then we have Persefone with Truth Inside the Shades in 2004.
Now it's time to leave your soul life, run and dream with a running fate.
Love the classy piano intro, which is very much something I associate with this more melodically focused era, and it's clear from the first notes of Whisper of Men that this album was influenced by the Gothenburg, again, melodeath scene, namely Dark Tranquillity and In Flames, though I also hear notes of Dimmu Borgir and Swedish black metal band Vindir, whose mastermind Valfar had died this same year. As a big fan of all of that, this is right up my alley. I love the neoclassical guitars and equally earworm synth work for a great balance of hooks and overall atmosphere. Tracks like Truth Inside the Shades and Niflheim also showcase their progressive side with elements that remind me of Opeth and at times even Rush and Dream Theater. My only critique is that the clean vocals could be a bit stronger, and they do get a lot better from this album. Another one of the standouts on this list for me with a sound that is all their own and really capturing, I think, kind of the essence of this decade for me, at least what I was listening to. I'm putting it at fantastic. Then we have Aborted with The Purity of Perversion in 1999. I'm including this one because they didn't, again, quite fit the 90s death metal rankings list. I think they're much more of a 2000s band overall and kind of fit that sound. Great band, by the way, especially their last few albums. I love retro gore, but cool to see them start out right from the beginning with the horror samples and song titles that are just pure death metal and clearly inspired by the likes of Cannibal Corpse. At this point, though, not much of their own identity just yet, with Sven mostly breeing his way through a lot of this thing. There are some carcassy riffs on the Lament configuration, and I like the Hellraiser reference. Not bad, but nothing jumps out at me either, just very average stuff, so this one's going to okay. Then we have Misery Index with Retaliate in 2003. These guys start off super brutal as well compared to where they are now. This is really just bloody, intense music with really raw production and plenty of blast beats just going straight for the throat. No frills, just pure aggression with some of their hardcore influences also showing from the very beginning, like the D-beat sections on The Great Depression or the gang vocals on Demand the Impossible. Nothing mind-blowing here, but at just over 30 minutes, there's very little fat on the bone and the drumming is just pulverizing. Just a bone breaker of a record that is just kind of fun. I'm putting this one at great tier. Then we have Obscura with Retribution in 2006. Another band I've been pretty much loving every album from due to their more progressive approach to songwriting. That said, they clearly hadn't quite hit their stride yet with this one. Another pretty meat and potatoes album, and their lowest fan rated on Metal Storm at 7.4, with the much more popular Cosmogenesis 3 years later jumping to an 8.6. This one has some interesting twists here and there with the vocals and again hints at their more progressive approach. I do like None Shall Be Spared, Exit Life, and the very death-influenced Hate Anthem. I'm going to put this one at good tier. And speaking of Necrophagist, we have Onset of Putrefaction in 1999. Another case of an album that's technically from the 90s, but I think it fits a little bit better with this group than the classic era bands, although arguably I probably could have done the same thing with Nile now that I think about it. This also definitely helped to set the stage for everything from the Faceless to Beneath the Massacre. Recorded almost entirely by guitarist and vocalist Mohamed Soukmez, and I'm probably butchering that pronunciation, I'm sorry, with some additional help, but man is it a wild ride and about as technical as they get with tracks like Intestinal Incubation and Culinary Hyperversity, and that bass on Fermented Awful Discharge. And also I'm always impressed with a band that can balance this level of showmanship with engaging songwriting so that it doesn't just become style over substance. Crazy to see a band this talented drop 2 highly influential albums and then just hang it up. I gotta put it at perfection. Next up is Origin with Origin in 2000. Full disclosure, I've listened to a number of this band's albums and I've just never really been super impressed. This one didn't substantially change my mind either, but it's better than their new stuff and no doubt those Gravity Blasts are a beast. I also found it to be a bit more engaging than some of the other albums on this list, with tracks like Sociocide and Infliction showing a bit more individual personality and memorability factor. It's mainly the vocals here again that I'm not a huge fan of. I'm gonna put this one at good tier. Alright, we have Blood Red Throne with Monument of Death in 2001. I was a little skeptical starting this one up, but once Portrait of a Killer starts kicking into those thrashy transitions and hypnotic grooves, I was totally into it. Souls of Damnation keeps that same energy going, and there is just this malevolent bloodthirst to The Children Shall Endure, getting some mild The Haunted vibes from that one in particular. Merry Whispers of Death and Ravenous War Machine are Rift City, Malignant Nothingness is infectious as all hell, Dream-Controlled Murder has some fantastic atmosphere and almost reminds me of Dimmu Borgir. Once more, my only real complaint are the extremely one-note vocals, which are kind of dull in comparison to the instrumentation and drag what could be a Perfection album probably down just a little bit, but even with that, it's going to fantastic. Alright, we have Malignancy with Intrauterine Cannibalism in 1999. This is our final 90s album on the list that was recommended in the Discord, and unfortunately, easily my least favorite by a lot. Again, I'm not a big fan of this brutal style of vocals to the point that I've always found it to be actually kind of goofy. Like, there will be some great drumming going on, and I'll start grooving with the guitars, but then he comes in with the blah, 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 and I just kind of start laughing. Some people love that, more power to them. I just can't with that, so it's going to okay. Moving on to Ulcerate with Of Fracture and Failure in 2007. Another band I'd consider more part of the 2010s movement that didn't really start to take off until 2009's seminal Everything is Fire. That said, this album already showcases the band's especially chaotic approach to drums and guitar. In fact, at times with the vocals here, it almost feels more in line with the mathcore albums of the decade. Performances and instrumentation are definitely a cut above the rest, somehow turning dissonance into a hypnotic drone with tracks like The Mask of Satyr. And I love the eerily chill turn of tracks like Failure. The only reason this isn't higher is that the songwriting just isn't quite on par with some of the competition here. It's no Vermis, but it's definitely going to great tier. And I have to say, I saw these guys live in like a little hole-in-the-wall venue, and they were fantastic. All right, we have Mithras with Forever Advancing Legions in 2002. Big dramatic organ intro for this one, which makes the explosion of instrumentation all the more jarring on the appropriately titled Trample Their Works. Now, I'm of two minds on this one, as if their goal is as a death metal band to just be as loud and destructive as possible, they've certainly achieved that. But at the same time, the peaking audio and distorted mix can really get quite exhausting to the point I feel like my brain just starts to shut down completely. Metal Archive scores seem to love it, but Metal Stormers have it at 7.8. At the very least, it stands out, and in a way its savagery reminds me of a more death metal take on early Sepultura mixed with a more raw version of Behemoth's Demigod. And the interludes offer your ears some brief solace between the carnage, wild soloing too. Overall props where it's deserved, but ultimately it doesn't rise much higher to me than good, at least at this moment. Alright, we have Benighted with Benighted in 2000. Been a huge fan of this French band's modern output, highly recommended if you like stuff like Aborted. This album is not available on Spotify for whatever reason, and it may not be the biggest loss though, because it's pretty rough mix, and the drums have similar problems as Vader's Litany, except that's a much better album. Just a cacophony of chaotic distortion and kind of bizarre vocals that sort of remind me of early Cradle of Filth, but somehow even more grating. The only thing really of note here is the interesting approach to how they implement the more melodic elements, which I would say is markedly different from any other album on this list since they started out with more of a black metal influence. So highly recommend Benighted. Check out their other albums, but maybe don't make it this one. It's going to okay tier. Alright, a big one here. We have Lykathea Aflame with Elvefrenis in 2000. Probably mispronounced pretty much all of that, but I'm glad that y'all shouted this one out on the community tab post because I almost missed it. Just another reason why I love this channel, because not only do I get to recommend weird, obscure stuff to you, but you get to do the same thing for me. This is some really impressive and in some ways ahead of its time progressive death metal that manages to be both beautiful and brutal at the same time with its clear Middle Eastern influences, complete with what sounds like some subtle simulated sitar at times. I'm a big fan of Cult of Fire, which in some ways I'd consider to be the black metal counterpart to this, and notably both bands have roots in Czechia. Quite frankly, this is the most unique album of this entire list, by a long shot, almost beyond words. And rather than feeling like just a gimmick, it manages to be entrancing for its entire lengthy hour and 12-minute runtime. I'll admit I initially saw that and wanted to bash my head against the wall, but I assure you it's a real treat, best experienced as a whole. This one is going to perfection. Please do go listen to it if you haven't already. Next up is Revocation with Empire of the Obscene in 2008. Really love me some modern Revocation, especially the outer ones, but these guys have been pretty consistently killing it with their own trademark mix of death and thrash metal for a while now. Very impressive sound for a self-release as a trio with plenty of shredding. Right out of the gate, Unattained is a killer opener, setting the bar high from the start. Tale from the Crypt follows that up just as strong. Exhumed Identity feels like it's mixing Megadeth with Carcass, and then things get pretty proggy around Suffer These Wounds and Alliance and Tyranny. Start to finish, excellent listen. Putting it at fantastic, it almost went to perfection. Alright, kind of a fun one here. We have Death Clock with Death Album in 2007. This may seem like a silly pick, but I feel like Metalocalypse was a huge part of the metal lexicon in the 2000s, and I saw quite a few recommendations for it as well. And as someone who actually saw Brendan Small perform this live with Brian Beller on bass and fucking Gene Hoglan on drums as the headliner with Mastodon, High on Fire, and Converge, they were the real deal. The lyrics may be intentionally comedic and the music is clearly kind of a roundup of so many other death metal tropes, but Brendan proved his worth as a Juilliard-trained musician both in the performances and songwriting. And I can't tell you how many times I've rocked out to the likes of Mermaider, Awaken, Thunderhorse, and Death Harmonic. Banger album that showed so much legit love for the scene. I ended up putting it at great, but I really could put it higher. It's one of my most re-listened albums on this entire list, but I still think it does kind of get beat out by some of these higher ones. And then we have the Black Dahlia Murder with Unhallowed in 2003. Trevor, rest his soul, listed this album as his number one in spite of the shortcomings even he recognized about it. I loved this album when it dropped, and I still love it to this day. It's so obvious to me why it rocketed them to the top of the scene almost immediately. This was the beginning of a new modern chapter for melodic death metal that seemed to love and worship the genre's roots while also taking their own twist on it. Every single song is killer, but my personal favorites include Funeral Thirst, Elder Misanthropy, and Closed Casket Requiem. For me, this one also has to go to Perfection, an iconic and unskippable benchmark of this decade. Y'all again, check out this playlist for more death metal rankings, and let me know down in the comments what else would you include, how would you rank some of these differently. Let's get a discussion going. But that'll do it for now. Flight of Icarus signing off. I will see you in the trenches.